Hello once again, genre connoisseurs. Tour de Force here. I've been listening to a lot of post-punk lately, especially the Talking Heads, and I've been wondering, where did this genre even come from? If you do not know what post-punk is, it's basically the more mature version of normal punk rock, like the Ramones, the Clash. We'll be diving into the vast history of post-punk, its creation, its death, and its rebirth, all in one video. Anyways, let's get into it. Day one, here we go. As with all of these genre guides videos, I like to start at the very beginning with this genre's inception. Now, the genre punk rock is usually known to have started out as proto-punk, being kickstarted by bands such as the Stooges, the Velvet Underground, the Sonics, the Kinks, and the MC5. But we're not really talking about punk rock in this video. I'd say the real starting points of post-punk, maybe proto-post-punk, was in 1972 with the breakthrough krautrock album, New. New's first album is already an influential ambient album on its own, but if you really dig deeper and understand the scope of what post-punk is, you can really hear traces of it in this album. The tonalities on Hollow Gallow not only defined ambient rock, but also defined future post-punk that was yet to come years later. Minimalistic progressions and a simple drumming style, known as the motoric beat, gave this band its signature, repetitive sound. That's a lot about New though, so here's some other important albums and artists to this proto-post-punk. Roxy Music's Brian Eno and Pere Ubu are generally considered to be the real first post-punk artists. Brian Eno's breakthrough avant-garde album, Taking Tiger Mountain, and Pere Ubu's not as much of a breakthrough single, 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, really focused on the dark, dissonant tones. I'd say these albums are like brothers, in that they fulfill different roles while having the same ideas. After these two breakthrough pieces of art, it wasn't 2 years later until post-punk really started to kick off. I think this was also due to normal punk rock kicking off, which also happened around the same time when the Sex Pistols and the Ramones released their debuts. While punk rock was busy thrashing everyone around in fits of rage and mania, post-punk was instead heavily introspective. There's no better proof of this than television's 1977 masterpiece to punk music, Marquee Moon. Alongside other bands of the famous 70s CBGB scene, which was a live venue known for hosting great punk acts, this is an extreme contrast to Sex Pistols' in-your-face overdrive tones, politically charged vocals, and novicely played instruments. Although to be fair, Sex Pistols' breakup in 1978 led to Public Image Limited, which is a post-punk band. Even Iggy Pop, the icon of the Stooges and thus the icon of punk rock, joined in on this new form of punk with his experimental album, The Idiot, being focused on dark, anxious tones and a heavy use of synthesizers. 1977 was probably the most important year for post-punk, as it also brought around the new wave. Very much a counterpoint to the post-punk movement, but very important nonetheless. Talking Heads is the obvious king of this genre, but there's other notable new wave artists such as Devo, Elvis Costello, Blondie, Ultravox, XTC, Magazine, and even David Bowie to some extent. Pere Ubu also came back in 1978 with their debut album masterpiece known as The Modern Dance, a very avant-garde album that showed the chaos that was possible within post-punk. Most of the important bands talked about so far have been from the good old US of A, but there are a lot of British bands that were also as vital to this genre. Specifically, Joy Division, Gang of Four, and Wire. Gang of Four specifically brought about a sort of end to the 70s post-punk era with their debut album Entertainment in 1979. This album focuses heavily on danceable rhythms and political themes on society. Now, I've talked about Wire before in my experimental rock video, so watch that if you want to hear about this band, but Joy Division I haven't talked about before. This band really started the popularization of this genre with their debut album, Unknown Pleasures, whose merch sold more than the actual album itself. Regardless though, this album showed a pivotal shift in post-punk's direction. Day two, let's do this. Joy Division also kickstarted the Gothic Rock movement of the 80s, which is yet another offshoot of post-punk that sounds like your typical visit to Hot Topic. But Joy Division was a very influential band to post-punk's dark Gothic side. Later bands like The Cure, Bauhaus, Killing Joke, The Chameleons, and Zuzi and the Banshees would later dominate this subgenre. Yet another subgenre appeared from the post-punk Gothic Rock movement as well, named Ethereal Wave, which would be mostly dominated by the Cocteau Twins and Dead Can Dance. After Joy Division's Closer, the passing of frontman Ian Curtis brought about the 80s New Order, which combined post-punk with synth-pop and danceable rhythms. The 80s in general had some great post-punk experimentation in it. Bands such as Wipers, Mission of Burma, and Minutemen found a way to combine the complex songwriting styles of post-punk with the energy of hardcore punk. This was later deemed post-hardcore, but at the time it was just called hardcore. Experimental band This Heat would release their magnum opus Deceit, which would cover many genres from avant-prog to industrial to krautrock and sound collages, but was still very much rooted in post-punk music. The only reason I didn't bring them up earlier is because their 1979 debut was really an experiment on proto-electronic music. Two amazing albums though that I recommend to anyone who loves experimental, weird, and difficult music. The Birthday Party's Nick Cave also formed the Bad Seeds, which had a great run of post-punk albums in the 80s. The Birthday Party were stuck on the more bluesy and noisy side of post-punk, while the Bad Seeds were instead stuck on the Gothic Rock side of things. Now I try to stay relatively unopinionated in these videos, but opinion incoming. Post-punk's major 80s sellout bands, REM and The Smiths, combined post-punk with pop music. That's not to say I don't like The Smiths, but regardless, this genre was deemed jangle pop. There's also popular band U2, which is pretty poppy but isn't jangle pop. Their early 80s albums, Boy and War, were heavily rooted in post-punk, but they later removed a large chunk of that influence on 1987's The Joshua Tree. The Feelies, The Fall, The Gun Club, The Sound, The Sisters of Mercy, lots of the bands. This decade was very busy. Even the Jesus and Mary Chain is considered post-punk, but I've already covered them in my shoegaze video. I also think The Fall is an important band, although I personally have a hard time getting into them. If there are any fans of The Fall, let me know which album I should listen to specifically. Now we're moving on from the 70s and the 80s to focus more on the 90s. And the 90s had basically fucking nothing. Post-punk started to really fall off in popularity after around 1989's Disintegration by The Cure. There were still some notable albums, but they were very rare throughout the 90s, unlike the huge explosion we got in the 70s and 80s. Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds were still making post-punk albums, and the highlight here is 1994's Let Love In. Rooted in the goth rock subgenre of post-punk, this album has some very dark lyricism and tones that are quite overwhelming at times. No wave band Swans also experimented heavily with goth rock tonalities on many of their albums, but more specifically on the 1995's The Great Annihilator. This album is very much a cornucopia of different genres, and it does a decent job of blending them all together. The 90s rock scene was known for its use of noise, and that influence was very apparent on the post-punk genre. Bands such as Brainiac, Dog-Faced Hermans, and Six Finger Satellite all heavily experimented with noise and dissonance, sort of similar to what Para Ubu was doing in the 70s. Many other lesser-known projects came out around this time as well, but nothing really groundbreaking. This decade was not nearly as busy as the other two decades, but that was all about to change in the 2000s. Give it up for day 3. The 90s were as dry as the Sahara Desert when it came to this amazing subgenre, but that begs the question, would the 2000s fare any better? The answer is yes, but no. Any late-stage Zoomer knows what genre is up next, and that is right, post-punk revival. I guess the 90s were considered so bad for this genre that the 2000s decided to revitalize and renew the genre under the revival tag. This revival brought around an insane amount of hits in terms of popularity at least. Aside from the 70s Joy Division and 80s The Cure and The Smiths, post-punk revival was the true mainstream breakthrough to the masses. The 2000s revival genre started out with smaller, lesser-known albums such as the debut album, Placebo's Slave to the Wage single, and, more importantly, Interpol's Precipitate EP. The reason why the Interpol EP was so important was that it brought around the most defining statement of the post-punk revival genre, their 2002 debut album, Turn On the Bright Lights. This breakthrough album really showed what the revival genre was about, combining the influences of new wave's rhythmic structures and indie rock's carefree attitude, with the aesthetics of, mostly 70s, post-punk. Unlike the 70s and 80s post-punk, however, this revival genre prioritized clean, professional recording quality and production, instead of the rougher, raw sounds in those older DIY scenes. It also prioritized more melodic, poppy song structures and melodies. Turn On the Bright Lights' sound is very much inspired by Joy Division, but it's not a direct copy. There's also Is This It by The Strokes, which came out 1 year before Interpol's magnum opus. Another smash hit album that used post-punk revival as an influence, and combined it with garage rock revival and indie rock. Garage rock revival is something else entirely, so we'll move on from there. After Interpol's album, we'd again have a small break until the next big breakthrough. Until that breakthrough, however, the UK's British Sea Power would release their debut album in 2003. A very odd sounding album that I think is worth checking out. They also made the outstanding Disco Elysium soundtrack, by the way. We also have The Metric and The Rapture coming out with their debut albums, and even some singles by Yeah Yeah Yeahs and The Killers. Then in late 2003, The Strokes came out with yet another album, Room on Fire, which really brought this revival genre into the spotlight, or the bright light. Bands from 2004's Franz Ferdinand and The Killers, to 2005's Block Party, to 2006's The Arctic Monkeys, and to 2007's The National, these bands all wanted a piece of the revival pie. And many of the albums these bands released were to great audience acclaim, especially The Arctic Monkeys and The Killers. These two bands would score hit after hit on the charts due to their mainstream appeal and accessibility. This revival genre truly took over the punk scene in the 2000s, and the numbers don't lie. Even noise rock pioneers, Sonic Youth, wanted to join in on the action, with their somewhat audience-splitting album in 2006, Rather Ripped. I'm not sure if it's fully part of the post-punk revival scene, but it's certainly inspired by it, and contains many similar characteristics. 90s indie rock and Midwest emo band Modest Mouse also joined in with their albums Good News for People Who Love Bad News and Were Dead Before the... Oh my god, this is actually insanely hard to say. Also joined in with their albums Good News for People Who Loves Bad News and We Were Dead Before the Ship Even Sank, which also certainly alienated some of their audience. The last major albums of the 2000s worth mentioning are Death Consciousness by Have a Nice Life, which I've already talked about in my shoegaze video as well, and Sound of Silver by LCD Sound System. This album had its own revival sound, that being of Gang of Four's Entertainment. The energy of this album is very apparent, and it's very focused on danceable rhythms with a synthesizer background. Absolutely a must listen for post-punk and dance punk lovers.
I am invincible in these sunglasses.
God damn it. Fourth and final day. Now we're getting to the more current times with the 2010s, which also brought around the decline of post-punk revival. The sheer amount of popularity, radio play, and overall oversaturation brought around a swift death to the revival genre, starting in 2010 and really dying down in 2016. One oddly standout album of the 2010s is Atatsi by which is more notable for its weird modern-day popularity than anything. This album attempted a sort of revival to cold wave, a post-punk subgenre built on synthesizers, electronic drum sets, and atmospheric production. In fact, the 2010s and 2020s saw a slight revival of cold wave in general. I'm not really sure why. Back to post-punk revival, there was some activity in the 2020s, but it'll never have the same popularity as it did in the 2000s, even with Paramore's big comeback album, This Is Why. So, the revival scene died down. Does that mean that it's officially over for the post-punk genre as we know it? Even ignoring Daughters' breakthrough noise rock album with definite post-punk influence, You Won't Get What You Want? I don't think so, and that's no more apparent than with the windmill scene of Brixton, London, England. Sort of Britain's modern-day version of the New York CBGB scene. This live music venue brought 4 major bands that would contribute to post-punk in a major way. Black Midi would release their 2019 debut album, Schlagenheim, to great underground acclaim and popularity. This cacophony of an album combines many different genres, from noise rock, to math rock, to no wave, and, obviously, post-punk. If you enjoy noisy, complex music that is set on confusing you with its blistering speed, give this one a try if you haven't already. There's also Squid's 2021 debut album, Bright Green Field, being more rooted in that danceable Gang of Four style. Black Country New Road released their debut album in 2021 as well, being heavily influenced by Slint's Spiderland and other post-punk bands like Television. Then we have the last of the 4 titans of the windmill scene with the band Shame, which is probably the most obviously aggressive one of the 4, and the least artsy of the 4 in my opinion. Still a worthwhile listen though if you like the other 3. Funnily enough, I'd consider the windmill scene as the second revival of post-punk, maybe a sort of mini revival. Moving on from the windmill scene, we have Idols, which is as aggressive as it is funny. Joy as an act of resistance got pretty popular in the underground scene and the mainstream. Give it a listen for sure. Noise rock band Model/Actors debuted in 2023 with their album Dog's Body, and fused extremely noisy industrial backgrounds with Gang of Four's dance punk energy. A very unique listen. Experimental and neo-psychedelia artist Eve Toomer also fused post-punk with their signature sound in their 2023 album, I'm not saying that full title. Listing off some other notable artists such as Genesis Owusu, Viagra Boys, King Cruel, Fontaines DC, and Proto-Martyr, post-punk is still very much alive and kicking to this day, even in terrible TikTok songs. Recently in 2024, The Cure made a large comeback with their album Songs of a Lost World, after 16 years of no major releases. This album sees a return in that classic 1980s goth rock sound, and I definitely recommend giving this one a listen if you like the cold, dark, yet beautiful atmosphere of The Cure's songs. Well, that was a lot of information to uncover, and I'm sure I missed a lot. As we can see with recent albums and popularity within this genre, it's not going anywhere, and is still a popular format for bands to be inspired by. These genre guides videos are getting awfully specific, so let me know if you guys like this amount of detail in the comments below. Throughout this video, we've covered post-punk, new wave, gothic rock, and even some dance punk, and all of these genres are worth checking out. Thank you all for watching. Take care. Tour de Force out.